Okay, so is there any other housekeeping I need to do before we start? No,
Let's go.
we're here. So I'm going to give myself a brief introduction, which is to say that I went to boarding school, as I think everyone in this room probably knows, and I've had a lot of difficulties in my relationships during my life, and recently traced how they kind of link back to my boarding school experience. And so, having become a coach, I then realized that this is something that really interests me because I can use my coaching skills to work on myself, to understand what was going on. And you see, I can't do this very well. John, is there anything else I should be telling these people? Because I really have not very well today, as you know.
No, I think it's enough. This conversation is going to be about what happens in childhood can echo into adulthood. Both you and I have the shared experience of boarding school, but there are other people for whom what we say will be equally applicable, even though they didn't go to boarding school.
Yeah.
The simple fact is, what happens to you in your childhood, your infancy, your childhood, and your adolescence creates patterns of thought and behavior which continue to echo through into your adult life and can control your adult life unless you are able to develop the discipline to observe and then change those patterns of behavior. So this is starting from the two of us both coming from boarding school, but it extends out from that into, as adults, how do we change the stories by which we live?
Exactly. And John, you skipped ahead and we haven't introduced you.
So I also went to boarding school. I had a totally miserable time, thoroughly hated it. Triple whammy of being a music and academic scholarship boy. I was a bright, arty boy in a muscular Christian rugby worshipping school. That was not a good thing to be. Secondly, I was the son of a teacher, and not a very popular, well, he was in some ways a very popular teacher, but he was very old by the time I went there and was viewed with contempt. And every time he upset somebody, it got taken out on me. And I was, extensively group bullied. I was a boarder there, and I was extensively bullied for about 3 years of my senior school. For 3 years, basically, nobody spoke to me except to insult me. And the senior boys, the so-called elite of the school, felt they had full permission to beat the hell out of me whenever they wanted to. Now, I left boarding school going, that's all right, it's finished, I'm over it. Great, yes, I survived. Good.
Yes.
And then, 20, 30 years later, I begin to really look at it and go, no. There's patterns there that I have not actually looked at. And this was brought into focus by me because I had a career traveling all over the world constantly. And at the age of 55, which is 4 years ago, I had a heart attack. And then the pandemic wiped out my career. So I ended up with plenty of time to think. And I really noticed that I was living with profound but almost invisible anxiety, continual anxiety. And almost all of my actions had been driven by either by anxiety or trying to avoid anxiety. I then did more reading into it, particularly into what is now called boarding school syndrome, as defined by Joy Shivarian, the psychoanalyst. And, I'm not a great one for saying I want to pathologize myself. I'm ill, I have a syndrome. I'm not interested in that. But being able to see some patterns as described by someone else in this case, Joy Shivarian, just helped me go, yeah, I recognize that in my life. I see that. And that noticing is the starting point for change. You don't get to change anything until you've noticed it. Yeah, if you try to change things without noticing them first, you're just randomly chucking stuff at the wall in the hope that something will stick. So first notice, then transform. So I'm now in a process, and it'll be a lifelong process, of both changing some patterns and also, if I'm to be honest, learning to love. There's a word I always find a little difficult, but love and forgive those things in myself that I have hated for years, because I go, they're part of who I am. They're where I come from. They're part of what's made me able to do the things I have done. You know, there's a process of acceptance and forgiveness instead of loathing parts of myself and pretending that they don't exist, and then desperately trying to change everything so I can become somebody who could never exist. You know, so that's sort of my journey over particularly the last 5 years, since my heart decided it was time for me to slow down a little.
I think what you said earlier, John, about we left school and it was like, oh, it's in the past now. I don't have to think about that anymore. And not realizing that it had become all those patterns that we developed to keep ourselves safe at school, and the way we were coping with it, had become kind of part of who we'd become, or like I think was character.
Yeah.
And which is, you know, what Joy Shavarian calls boarding school syndrome, and Nick Duffel calls the strategic survival personality.
Yeah. We can trace this on, you know, this is true for everyone, irrelevant where you went to school, irrelevant of your background. There are stages of maturing that we go through which require certain kinds of external circumstances for them to be healthy. John Bowlby, in his work on attachment theory, talks about the first couple of years, the nature of the attachment between the infant and their primary caregiver, how formative that is. Joy Shavarian, in her work on boarding school syndrome, points out, this was a shock to me when I read it, because like many people, I was always ashamed to say that first of all, I was actually quite ashamed to say I went to boarding school, but also quite ashamed to complain about having gone to boarding school. Yeah. But Joy Shavarian points out something very important. The child who is sent off to boarding school, in my case, it was at the age of 8, the child who is sent to boarding school is a textbook definition of the child being put in care.
Yeah.
The child, a child who is in care is a child who has been voluntarily or involuntarily, usually voluntarily, relinquished by their parents to the care of the state or another institution. And although we might go, yeah, but you were privileged, whatever, she points out, and again, this was a shock to me, that most children who go into care know at a deep level that their parents didn't want this for them. But either their parents weren't able to cope, or, you know, they might feel that the state has been unkind and taken them from their parents. The child who's sent to boarding school knows that this is what their parents chose for them. And, you know, it's not rational. I'm not sitting there in bed at the age of 8 going, wow, I must psychoanalyze this situation. I'm talking about the lived experience of the child at the age of 8, 9, 10, 11, whatever, who goes, I am separated from all the things that I know and that make me feel safe. I've lost my, you know, the pet cat doesn't sit on my bed anymore. My teddy bear isn't here. You know, the food is disgusting.
Vile.
You know, and the child is going, this is what my parents chose for me. Not rational, not thinking, experienced. The child has had removed from her or him the fundamental of belonging. And then at the next stage, as you move into adolescence, you move into 14, 15, 16-year-old, it's the age where you're supposed to be, you know, what young people are meant to be doing is testing the boundaries of the family. disobeying the parents, finding your peer group, seeing where you fit in, always, we hope, being able to run back to the parents for hope and support when the world gets too scary. But it's also about going out and finding yourself. None of that in boarding school. None of that possible. And I listened to, of all things, Desert Island Discs, not a program I listen to very often, but Ade Edmondson, the comic on Desert Island Discs. And I actually listened to the podcast version, which I didn't realize is longer than the broadcast version. It was about an hour and 10 minutes. So I don't know what was in the broadcast version, but he, it was an extraordinary podcast. I found it very, very moving. And he just said something really powerful when he said that in his family, he was the only one sent away to boarding school. He was the eldest. All his younger siblings stayed at home, but they got rid of him. And he said, I was put into a place where there was no love. For years, there was no love. And my experience exactly, there is no love at the age of 8. And the only love that was available in my school was sexual abuse. That's, of course, not love, but it is, the ghastly bastard twin of I offer you some affection, I offer you hugging, whatever. Now, I have to say, as the son of a teacher in that school, I was not sexually abused. I mean, I'm sure the rest of the staff knew that would be a especially foolish idea. But the sexual abuse was there. That simple, So it's a terrible thing to do to a child. And yes, some children thrive, some children love it, some children have a great time. Doesn't alter the fact that for many, many children, to be sent away to school, to be sent away from the family, whatever form that takes, is a tremendously destructive and dangerous thing, which does change your journey into adulthood. Even if you had a good time, it changes your journey into adulthood. Some are just better than others, and there's all sorts of reasons why that might be. But these are not, this is not self-pity and it's not whinging. These are as close as I can get to researched facts. Simple researched facts.
And I think I'd add to that, John, that process that we go through as a child or an adolescent, trying to understand why our parents sent us to boarding school. I mean, for me, it was, my parents gave me this nonsense story about, the schools locally are going to go comprehensive, it'll be chaos and you'd be better off in a boarding school. And at the age of 11, I think I believed it. And then I pleaded with them to let me come home. I'd rather go to the local convent than stay here any longer. And they said no. And later, much later on in life, like after I'd left school, maybe in my early 20s or early 30s, my mother revealed it was because of my dad's depression. And that is not in its, I'm not going to judge them for that decision. They made the best decision they could in the circumstances. But what's interesting is the absolute acrobatics we go through trying to balance not judging our parents and not expressing the anger that we feel, whilst at the same time trying to preserve our own self-esteem.
It's a massive, it's a huge thing. For me, the reason was different. That my parents both came from pretty difficult backgrounds. My father was from an artisanal family. His father was a carpenter. A master carpenter, but there was very little money in the house because there was also alcoholism in the house. My mother came from deep poverty. The single parent in the 1920s, succession of partners, poverty, having to leave the house in the middle of the night because the rent was due, all of this stuff. For my parents to be able to send me to boarding school was offering me the education they believed that they aspired to. My father had actually done an amazing thing from his background. He'd actually got his PhD in Oxford, you know, one of the first working class boys to get to Oxford. You know, really a huge achievement. My mother turned into a tough but sensitive, intelligent, you know, woman who became a nurse. She achieved a life despite leaving school at 14, probably unable to read, despite catching tuberculosis as a trainee nurse at the age of 18 and being given up for dead when she caught it from the soldiers coming back from the war. And the NHS went, put the trainee nurses on the soldiers. They're too dangerous and the trainees are expendable because we haven't fully. And then, you know, she gets TB and can't work in the NHS because in those days, if you'd had it, you couldn't go back into the NHS. So all of this stuff happened. And my parents got me to boarding school. And I'm sitting there going, this is hell. But my parents think they have done the best thing they possibly could for me. The conflict in that is massive. I never, only years later, did I let my parents know how unhappy I had been at boarding school. And if I'm to be honest, I underplayed how unhappy it was. And I'd never let my father know. I only let my mother know when really she was sort of in the stage of life where she wasn't going to be upset by it. She was at the stage of life where she was going, oh, well, what's happened has happened, you know, where I was manifesting being strong and capable and so on. And I say, yeah, it was really tough back at school. So she didn't feel like I was asking anything of her, but it was a massive thing to try to address that pain of having been sent away by the parents, but not knowing how to say to the parents or not understanding why the parents would have done it. And that absolutely echoes into your ability in later life to be direct and honest and to take responsibility for your own feelings and to ask other people to take responsibility for what they've done for you. For me, it has anyway. It's been a huge through line in my life, not being able to say to people, actually, that's not okay.
Yeah, it's and it's not peculiar to people who've been to boarding school either, is it, John? But
absolutely not. No,
it's a big thing. I would say also for me, it was having to be in control all the time, sort of a dysfunctional level of independence.
There's a good phrase there, Sorrel, dysfunctional independence.
Yeah.
When you're growing up, you learn what independence is for you through trial and error and exploration.
Yeah.
When you are in the actively or passively hostile environment of an institution, the consequences in the process of trial and error can be catastrophic. You say the wrong thing and everybody laughs at you, and you don't get to go home at the end of the day and go, that was a terrible day, and your mum gives you a hug. They laugh at you during the day. They laugh at you in the evening. When I was at the worst of getting bullied, they would not laugh at me. They would hit me at 2 o'clock in the morning. You know, I'd be fast asleep and suddenly there'd be a rain of blows coming down on the bed.
Which is something I can't imagine because I didn't experience that.
It's not, and you know, that's boarding school, but it's also any other institution or whatever.
Yeah,
it's unrelenting in the way that, you know, any kind of bullying is enormously destructive. If you have a functional home and you're getting bullied at school, at least you can return to the home. I'm not saying that makes the bullying at school any less destructive, but at least you can return to the home. If you have a dysfunctional home, but a functioning community, at least you might be able to go to the community centre, the youth centre. Not that such things exist in Britain anymore, pretty much. But those things that constitute a functioning society, they are places where you can go to try out your independence and to recover from mistakes.
And I would say that's why boarding school has been described as a total institution.
Yeah.
Alongside the army, prison, and I know there's some others that I can't think of off the top of my head, but you know that we were supplied with underwear when I started school. I forget at what stage they allowed us to provide our own underwear. I mean, it's ridiculous.
I'm betting it wasn't comfortable.
No, of course it wasn't. I can still remember those knickers. But you know, everything
It's
and every minute of
dehumanizing,
every
isn't it?
day is scheduled, isn't it? It's like,
Yeah.
okay, this is the period of the day when you write your letters home, and this is the period of I think we had about an hour time free every day.
Mm.
And we could do what we liked, but the rest of the day was entirely scheduled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It then becomes very hard as an adult to trust yourself to construct, you know, a functional day and a functional month and a functional life. And it becomes very hard to trust others to work somehow collaboratively with you rather than in a guarded, potentially hostile, potentially threatening way. In boarding school and any institution, probably, it's a place of intense friendships and then great pain when those friendships suddenly shatter. I mean, sitting here now in the Republic of Ireland, 45 years after the event, I can feel in my body, literally, this isn't a metaphor, it's a fact, the experience when I went back to the sort of the classroom where my year group, house group and year group had our desks, and saw all of my books trashed and graffiti over all of my textbooks, and the writing at the heart of the graffiti was beautiful copperplate writing, which I knew was done by my best friend. I knew who had led and instigated that day, which was the beginning of 3 years of bullying. And I can feel that in my body now. Now I've got a choice. We all end up having a choice, don't we? That either defines and limits our actions, or part of the same choice is, we spend our whole life fighting against it. Or you learn to sit with that feeling and say, yes, that happened, but it's over.
Yeah.
And now I will take responsibility in relationship with others, with coaches and mentors and friends and lovers and society and good people everywhere. I will take responsibility for not having that define me. But it's a conscious effort to do so. For years, I went, forget it. Nah, nothing important there. It's gone. I'm free. Doesn't work. The best that will come from that is that you'll bury it deep enough to get through life without dealing with it. But for me, that's what I did. And it still manifested as anxiety. And I'm not saying that the anxiety caused my heart attack, but it probably didn't help.
And I think it's so interesting also you said that it was the anxiety itself is quite hidden. You weren't so aware of it until recently. And I was the same. In fact, I think it was Mark who pointed out that I was anxious. I never realised.
I never really even knew anxiety existed. I would often go, I'm feeling a bit stressed. I'll stop myself being stressed. But the anxiety, the deeper level buzz of I am under threat. What if it goes wrong?
Yeah.
The deeper level buzz of fear of what if. I never even began to address that.
Well, it's like you said, if you don't know it's there, you can't address it.
And now, of course, you go, well, if I know that's there, I can begin to go, what am I anxious about? Am I anxious about the past? In which case I can choose to put it down. Am I anxious about the future? In which case, do something now to make sure that future doesn't happen. Or am I anxious about something that's happening now? In which case, deal with it. Sort it out. Work it out.
I think another aspect of it, John, is that for me, the anxiety is there all the time. And sometimes I wake, like in the morning, I wake up and start trying to find out why it is I'm anxious. And there's really nothing to be anxious about. But sometimes there is something to be anxious about, and then I hook onto that and dig in and say, okay, I'm anxious about whatever. But it's just like my brain, my mind trying to figure out what that anxiety is about, and there's nothing. It's almost like I'm not going to say it's hardwired, but using a computer metaphor, I think it's probably the firmware.
Yeah, it's this is true, but firmware, to use your metaphor, can also be updated.
Can be updated, exactly.
But it doesn't happen easily, and it doesn't happen quickly. The thing is, if I go, God, I'm feeling anxious. What am I anxious about? Oh, I'm anxious about that. I choose not to be anxious. That's a relatively quick process.
Yes.
If I do that 10 times about the same thing, I've sort of begun to solve that thing. But the deep level patterning of anxiety does change. It does change, but it changes slowly. And this is, fundamental to how humans learn, because I have learned through experience to be anxious. When I was at school, I learned that round a corner there might be somebody who would smack me on the back of the head. If I was lucky, it was the back of the head. I learned that if I got enthusiastic and said something silly, people would mock me. My anxiety is not stupid. It is a learned behavior in response to lived experience. Now, if I want that to change, I must give myself new lived experiences from which to learn new lessons. One of the places I think the self-help industry and all of that fall down is they say that if you can think it, you can change it. I don't think that's true. I think it's easy, it's marketable, it's easy to sell, it sounds nice, but I don't think it's true. I think if you can think it, you can consciously try to live it. And if you can consciously try to live it, over time, you will train yourself to change what you expect from the world. It goes down, the experience goes down and down. I am less anxious now because I consciously construct experiences for myself every day where I defuse my intrinsic anxiety. And I am learning I don't have to be anxious, but it takes time.
Yeah, it takes time. And there's all sorts of ways of doing that. A few months ago, I was doing a daily meditation practice with the same thing every day. And it basically was saying you can trust the universe. It's quite a nice idea, really. You can trust the entire universe. And it made a huge difference. Then trouble is I stopped doing it. But, and I'm not saying I'd have to keep doing it every day for the rest of my life, but I think it has started to make an impact on that patterning.
Yeah, I'm. Some people talk are very keen on the discipline of a lifelong repeated practice. The same meditation each day. I get that. I think I perfectly get that. I'm somebody who tends to do things for a while and then move on to something else. And I used to hate that about myself. Now I don't. Now I sort of go, I have a practice. There is one regular thing I do. I do Qigong every day I have done for about 5 years now. But there's other daily practices. At the moment, my daily practice, when I can, which won't be today because I'm busy all day, but when I can, I go for walks twice a day, for my heart, for the sake, no point in living in the middle of nowhere in the wilds and not getting outside. So, and when I'm on my walk, I find somewhere to stop, and for a time to 10 minutes, I simply look and listen. I sensually engage with the world. I look at the sea crashing on the rocks or the birds flying overhead or whatever, and I open my senses, not thinking I am becoming present, I am meditating about my place in the universe. I just be where I am. And it is tremendously powerful. And I'll do it for a few more months because it's great. And then, I'll probably find something else. Something else will go, I wonder what this would be like, and I'll do it for a few months. And I used to hate that sense that I'm not a lifelong rigid yogi or something. Now I like it. It's who I am.
So you are.
It's why in my reading I bring together poetry and neuroscience and spiritual literature. I'm somebody who brings things together. That's who I am as an artist. I've always brought things together. In terms of my personal practice, I bring things together.
That's really interesting. I'm wondering whether that, oh, this is going to sound a bit naff, whether that's actually part of the boarding school experience. I'm the same. I bring things. I can remember I got myself into real trouble at university because I insisted on stepping outside of what we were being taught and do other things, and then I'm out of time.
I think there is some evidence that although many people come out of boarding school, there are definitely a large number of people who come out really wanting to conform, and a large number of people who come out really wanting not to conform.
It's opposite ends of the pole.
Yeah, and then of course there's a spectrum in between, but I think there's some suggestion that both the desire to conform and the non-conformists are greater from boarding school people than among the general population. And certainly for me, I only survived in those years when I was being bullied. I only survived by creating an internal world that was non-conforming. I had a foot injury for a long time. It was a very small foot injury, but I managed to stretch it out for a year and a half to get out of sport for all of that time. And I had a very sympathetic music teacher who, you know, how many people say art teachers change their lives? He was a music teacher. He gave me the key to the music room, said there's some records in there during the afternoons when everyone's off doing their sport. You go in and listen to records. I made a world of listening to, you know, classical music, experimental classical music. There were some jazz records in there. I made a different world for myself, which was not the world of sport and muscular Christianity that the boarding school worshipped. You know, it was a colonial Christianity. I mean, it was very much the 19th century. Let's prepare boys to go out and dominate the world.
That's what boarding schools are for, isn't it, John? I mean, isn't that the whole point of boarding schools, is to prepare the future elites to go out and dominate, and not so much anymore, but in those days to go out and...
Historically, the 19th century boys' boarding school was absolutely about creating the officer class for the colonial army.
And that comes out in Nick Duffel's book.
Yeah.
Of them.
And, so, that actually, the philosophy that went behind it was of dehumanization.
Yeah.
We must train people not to feel, because they are going to go out and do things to other human beings which sensitive people wouldn't do.
Exactly.
Was it in Nick Duffel's book, the description of Eton in the 18th to 19th century, early 19th century, that Eton was, you know, we think of Eton now as a great big posh school. It was an absolute hellhole. That there was only one dormitory, massive, 200 or 300 boys in it, only one fire in it, and the more senior you were, the closer you got to the fire. There was continual violence, rats and mice all over the dormitory. Once, you know, they would have boxing matches without end. One boy killed because he went through something like 36 rounds of a boxing match with nobody stopping it. Absolute vicious, raw violence. So violent in the 19th century, there was actually a reform movement to try to stop boarding schools being so vicious, because they were actually set up to train people to be as psychotic as possible, so that they could go out and do the sort of things that the British did in India and, you know, running the slave trade. How could you just take a ship full of humans,
John?
You know,
I'm mindful of the time, and
yeah, sorry, I'm going off on one now. But that dehumanizing is really important to notice, because we also have to rehumanize ourselves when we become adults.
And I think the thing to remember is that even though boarding schools, I'm assuming, no longer set up to dehumanize people, I'm pretty sure that's the case now, that we lose touch with a certain part of our humanity, which is rooted in the fact that you go home every day to your parents and your siblings. I mean, never mind if you have a fight with your mum and your dad, you've probably got your siblings on your side.
Yeah, or at least you've got your cat.
Well, at least you've got your cat. And for me, as a girl in a girls' boarding school, it was a very different experience from what you had. And I would say the biggest hurt was the absolute indifference. And interestingly, I was watching a podcast with Esther Perel recently, who's a relationship and sexual coach, sex coach. I'm not quite sure how you word that. I'm sorry. And she was saying that there are 4 things which can lead to a relationship. One of them is indifference.
Mhm.
And it was really interestingly very hurtful to have no attention paid to. I'm going to stop talking because this is.
It's just an interesting thing. I can't remember who said it, but people often say love and hate are opposites, but it isn't true. The opposite of love is indifference. Love and hate are 2 sides of the same coin. It's a passionate connection with someone. The opposite of love is indifference. And that's always rung true for me, because when I went to boarding school, what I discovered was indifference. Frankly, nobody gave a damn if I lived or died, except it would have been faintly embarrassing to the school if I died, but that opposite of love is just a sense that you don't matter. And one of the most toxic things is that you can come out of that kind of ruptured adolescent believing that you don't matter. You no longer matter to yourself.
Yes.
Now that is, an appalling state to get into. The antidote to which is, and I'm nervous of the phrase because it's so degraded in our current, discourse, but the antidote of that is to move away from indifference towards yourself and into a genuine love of yourself.
Yeah.
Not love of the easy bits. That's the easy bit. Love of all the bits. Love of the flaws. Love of the failings. Love of the times you've hurt other people. Love for your love of the times where you've done things that you look back on and go, that wasn't who I want to be. Now that radical love is for me the healing love. But it's hard as hell. So easy to love the bits it's easy to love.
And it's easy to find the bits which you're happy to look for.
Yeah.
It's harder to find the bits that you don't want to look at.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good point to bring us talking to a close and ask if anyone has any questions. And I'm going to stop recording and stop streaming so we can keep it entirely private.